Hello everyone and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the online festival of ideas that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? Now today at the Diff we'll be exploring something that we all buy and has relevance to all of us, but often is more than just a functional purpose, and that is the clothes that we wear. It is becoming impossible to ignore the implications of the fast fashion industry. And yet, whilst we're all individuals with different attitudes to buying and wearing clothes, today we'll be delving into some of the latest research into the patterns surrounding consumer types and see if we can learn something important about the future of fashion. And on that note, I'd like to introduce you to Andrew Gilbert. Now, Andrew works on WRAP's successful Love Your Clothes consumer campaign and is also part of the team delivering WRAP's Sustainable Clothing Action Plan, which is committed to cut water, carbon and waste across the whole product lifestyle by 2020. So I'll hand over to you, Andrew, in a moment. But first of all, I'd like to say to everyone at home, please do contribute your questions and comments. You can do that by finding the little box just below this video stream, or you can go to Twitter and use the hashtag ThinkDiff, and we'll be keeping an eye out for any questions you have for Andrew. Now, you may need to complete a one-click process to access our chat window, but it's super quick and super simple, so don't be put off. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to you, Andrew.
Excellent. Thanks, Holly. Okay, so as Holly said, my name is Andrew Gilbert. I work for a company called WRAP, which is the Waste and Resources Action Programme. We're based in the UK. We're a not-for-profit. And our aim is to accelerate the move to a sustainable, resource-efficient economy. And we're doing that really by trying to rethink how we design, produce and sell products, invent how we use and consume those products, and then redefine what's possible through recycling and reuse. And in the UK, even if you've not heard of WRAP, you know our work. We have four main areas of work. One is working with local authorities. And here you'll see our consumer brand Recycle Now, a green swoosh with a heart on the end. It's everywhere. It's on the side of bin lorries as you come in on the road. We also work in the food sector. And here, if you pop into any supermarket, you're particularly likely to see our consumer campaign, Love Food, Hate Waste. And again, we work with the large producers of food to look at how they can be more resource efficient. We also work in the electrical sector, particularly with the large international players, and looking at their attitudes to returns. And really, sustainability for electricals is really quite interesting because there's a massive business case for brands and retailers to get involved there. For my area of the business, and I've been with WRAP for 8 years, and for the last 3 years, been working in the clothing and textiles team. As Holly said, we have a couple of things we do within textiles. We run a consumer campaign called Love Your Clothes, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And we also run something called the Sustainable Clothing Action Plan, SCAP. So I think probably worth just taking a step back and just to understand why we are looking at clothing. What's the impact? Well, clothing has a massive impact. It's a huge global sector. But within the UK, it's the 4th biggest environmental impact. So that's behind housing, it's behind transportation. And the reason for that mainly is because we buy so many clothes. In 2016, we updated our report, Valuing Our Clothes, which is our evidence base for all of our activity. And that showed that we're buying roughly 1.1 million tons of clothing in the UK each year. And that's adding to roughly 3.6 million tons of clothing we already own. And lots of that is sat in wardrobes not being used. And getting that back into active use is something we're trying to do. So there's a couple of ways that we can reduce our impact when it comes to clothing. And if I share this graph, you'll see what I mean. So SCAP, the Sustainable Clothing Action Plan, works with brands and retailers around production and fibre choice. So we work with about 55% of the UK market to help them move to more sustainable forms of fibres. So here it could be something simple like moving from a conventional cotton to a more sustainably produced form of cotton. So we're not asking them to switch fibres, we're just talking about changing to a more sustainable version. We also work with the reuse and recycling sector. And here we're very much looking to increase the amount of clothing which is being reused, but also find new markets for clothing which has to be recycled. So two of the really interesting products which are going on there at the moment is around fibre to fibre recycling. So taking clothes, post-consumer clothing, and turning it back into fibres, turning it back into fabrics, turning it back into clothing. And also looking a little bit at extended producer responsibility agreements. There's some of these across the globe at the moment, particularly in France, there's one. So looking at potentially how the people producing clothing, particularly and having an impact, can be asked to be more responsible about that. But the other big area, and as this graph shows, the most significant area we can all make a change is by extending the life of clothes and keeping clothes in active use for longer. And that is where the consumer campaign Love Your Clothes comes into play. So Love Your Clothes was created in 2012 and it is predominantly talking to consumers in the UK around how they buy, care for and dispose of clothing. So most of Love Your Clothes is delivered via social media campaigns, but we also do events with partners as we go forward. To better understand the problem of clothing and to drive consumer change was to look at behaviour and do some segmentation. So at the start of 2016, we started a survey and we spoke to people from all ages, from all socio-economic backgrounds, and we covered the length and breadth of the UK. And we analysed that data carefully, and what we discovered was there were 6 groups emerged. And irrespective of age or background, these segments started to form. Now, each of these segments share similar attitudes, motivations, and behaviours in the way they bought, cared for, repaired, and then disposed of their clothing. Now, while some of the segments were younger or older than others, each had a broad mix of demographics. Some segments were more urban, some are more rural, but they generally can have a mix. And this is an important point, really, because this is a behavioural segmentation. But what's interesting is, again, these groups formed around similar use of media. They had similar approaches to the type of technology and similar barriers to engagement. And by doing this work, what it allows us to do is prioritise those audience into the most willing to change and those that have the most negative impacts. Because the only way really to inspire consumers to take positive action and to change their unhelpful behaviours is to learn more about them, to understand how they buy their clothes, how they care for them, and their attitudes towards repair and disposal. This enables us, as part of the Love Your Clothes campaign, to target the right message in the right manner through the right channels and increase the probability of inspiring lasting change. As part of this segmentation work, we know which brands and retailers and supermarkets have the greatest resonance with different groups. And that helps us to select partners to deepen our engagement. And we know how receptive each segment is to our messages, how they like to be talked to, how they consume information, how they like messages presented, how much they trust us and how much who they trust, and which channels are the most effective ways to reach them. So here you've got the 6 different groups that we discovered: caring citizens, considered cost savers, well worn, open to ideas, proudly presented, and love shopping. And we'll talk a little bit more about those now. So the segmentation works in 2 ways. It looks at the importance of clothes to somebody's identity. That's the horizontal axis you can see here. And it also looks at their social value. And really here we're thinking about their attitudes towards wastefulness. And that's the vertical value. And this is how everybody appears. So this is caring citizens. And caring citizens are our largest group. They make up about 30% of the UK population, adult population. And they're very much a values-driven group. They like shopping, and they see clothes as an important part of their identity. This group generally are committed to ensuring they don't generate waste, and sometimes they'll go the extra mile, and they're concerned about environmental impacts. Being presentable and smart is crucial to this group. The second group we talked about was considered cost savers. Now this is 19% of the UK population, and all these circles are sized to represent the right size of the population. What's interesting about this group is they're slightly older and they're a bit more male. This group were they know what they like when it comes to clothing, and they don't like shopping. Generally their behaviours are not very good, but they are strongly motivated to reduce waste. Quality clothes are important to this group, but what they wear is not part of who they are. They have a very functional, transactional relationship to clothing. The third group is our well-worn group. This is only 10% of the UK population, and they're very similar to segment 2. But really they're defined by their dislike for clothes and shopping. They hate shopping. It's very interesting when we did this piece of work. After we developed each segment, we went back and did some video interviews with some people from different segments. And this well-worn group, a couple sat on their sofa, were talking about how they wear their clothes until they fall apart. And the man told an anecdote about walking along the high street and his clothing and his trousers failing and falling down by his ankles. And that's the point at which he decided he needed to buy some more clothes. This group hate clothes so much, they're not willing to go shopping until they start to disintegrate around them. Their ownership, care and disposal behaviours are driven by whatever's the easiest thing for them to do. And they don't really have a sense of ethical or green values or wider motivations. Segment 4 is our open to ideas group, and this is a younger segment and a slightly more urban segment as well. And so here, this is 16% of the UK population, and for this group, clothes are an important part of their identity, and they are frequent shoppers. Their behaviours generally aren't very good, but that's largely unthinking. They're not considering the impact of clothes or the wastefulness when they're thinking about clothing and the clothes they buy. They own a lot of clothes and they are open to learning more, which is why we call them open to ideas. Number 5 is our proudly presented group, about 20% of the UK population. This is an older group, and they enjoy clothes shopping and they do it fairly frequently. They're not motivated by price or environmental factors or wastefulness, but they do see clothes as an important part of their identity. Their ownership and disposal behaviours are fairly poor, and they don't really go out of their way to do the right thing. And then lastly is our smallest group, only 6% of the UK population, which we call love shopping. Now, they may be small, but they punch above their weight. So this group, 6% of the UK population, are doing 18% of the shopping trips. So they are fashion obsessed. Again, this is quite a younger audience. This is a more female audience, and clothes are absolutely central to their identity. They're nearly constant shoppers. So that's both online and on the high streets. They feel that they lead busy, chaotic lives, which means they often take the easiest option, and that often causes waste. They are values driven, but they don't really think they can make a difference. What's interesting about this group for us is they are interested in refashioning clothes. They are interested about making their clothes more personal to them. So what we did for each of those groups is we produced a scorecard. This is the scorecard for Open to Ideas, segment 4. And it's a very simple way of condensing down all of that information and data into a very easy to access bite-sized format. So it shows here that, as you can see, their behaviours are quite poor across the board. They're buying more than they need. They're not particularly buying in a smart way. By buying smart, we think about kind of different technologies which might be applied to clothes to make them last longer. So anti-pilling techniques, or even things like easy iron solutions. They're not particularly caring for their clothes. So, you know, washing at 30 degrees doesn't feature very highly for this group. They're not really interested in prolonging the life of their clothes. So here, that's around repair and caring for the clothes in the right way. And when it comes to disposal, unfortunately, this group's pretty poor again. So they are putting clothes in the bin. And if there's one message that everybody watching this can take away, is don't put your clothes in your bin. There's plenty of places to take your clothes. There's lots of people want your clothes. Charities want them. There'll be charity bags coming through your door. There'll be textile bins. All clothing can have another life, whether it's reuse or recycling. So I thought what I'd do is just kind of talk about some of our priority segments. So if I come back to the values and identity slide, you can see here that 2 and 3, well, they don't care about clothes. It's not important to them. So actually, from our point of view, having a conversation with them about clothing is almost pointless. So there are other ways to reach them, which we'll try and do through our other consumer brands like Recycle Now. So the other 4, 1, 4, 5, and 6 are of interest to us. But again, here we're prioritizing into where we can have the most impact. So definitely a priority for us are caring citizens. Number 1, and that's predominantly because they're such a massive part of the population, 30%. And they generally have good behaviours, as I said, and they enjoy shopping, and they take care of their clothes. And what's really interesting is they're very reachable, this group. They're digitally savvy. They have high traditional media usage, so lots of TV use, but they also got they're also online, and we especially find these people in places like Pinterest. They're very socially conscious, and these are the people who are likely to volunteer in their local community. And even though there's an age mix within this group, there's a high proportion which would have children at home. So that means schools are another great conduit for us to put our messages to this group. And we know that the messages that will work to this group aren't around environmental or green concerns. What really hits home to this group is their dislike of waste, and they respond well to clear and straightforward messages, and that anything really that encourages them or incentivizes them to do more. But they don't need to be convinced of the issues, because they're already there, they're already on our side. And that's really why we are focused on this group, because small changes will have a big impact, but also because for us they become advocates to the cause. And we can encourage them to maintain their excellent behaviours and pass those on to their friends and family. Second priority group for us here is 4, open to ideas. And as you saw from the scorecard, the reason these are a priority group for us is because their behaviours are just so poor across the board. And it's also interesting because this is the group which is more male than others. And quite a lot of the time when we're campaigning, there is a female focus, just because of the amount of clothes women buy. But here, within this group, we can have a bit of fun and trying to inject some humour into our campaigning. So this group value clothes. They want to learn more about it. So they're open to ideas. They're very tech savvy. Very socially active, this group. High levels of multiple social networks, including Twitter and YouTube. They're less likely to use more traditional media channels, especially newspapers, not really a way to reach them. They're not especially trusting, this group, but they're also not overly cynical about messages from charitable organisations. For this group, when we're talking to them, it has to be simple and clear instructions, particularly on disposal, that really resonate with this group. If we can back that up with hard-hitting messages about the environmental impact, this group will listen. They need information about how they can act, and they are compelled to take action by celebrity endorsements or incentives. And as clothes are important to their identity, it can be they particularly find it frustrating when they break. So they're keen on simple instructions and life hacks on how they and tips on how they can make their clothes last longer. Ultimately, here the focus should be in ensuring this group becomes advocates, so they do take on board our messaging and then pass it on to their peer groups. And the last focus group really for us is segment 6. I say it's the smallest group, only 6%, but purely because of the amount of clothes they buy, this has to be a priority for us. So this is a small group. It's young and fashion obsessed. And as we said earlier, clothes are so important to their identity. It's a really tech-savvy group and socially active, which means for us, from a campaigning point of view, they're really accessible and very reachable. They use all types of social networks and online news sources, and they're very trusting, which is great for us. But messages to them really need to resonate with their lives because they're busy and time pressured.
Andrew, I'm just going to jump in here
and
ask you to make a quick clarification. Are you targeting the people who have the bad behaviour, or are you targeting groups that you think it'd be easiest to change to the desired behaviour of wearing your clothes more?
Holly. It's a mix of both, Holly. So with segment 1, they're a priority for us because of their size, but generally they have pretty good behaviours. So it's getting them on board to become advocates for people for other groups. Whereas
just on that segment as well, I guess I have another quick. Sorry, just some questions coming up. How much do you think of that is reported behaviour or is actual behaviour? I feel like there's quite a lot of people who would say that they have a good idea of what's going on and why waste is bad, but if they're quite high on the social values or the why they'd want to wear clothes a lot, how much do you think that interacts?
We find that a lot. So we're certainly on a lot of survey work. What you find is when we ask a question about what's your attitude towards this, and you get the answer you want to get. But what we've become very good at over the years is asking the same question different ways. So you actually start to see what they think the ideal behaviour is versus what they do. And actually, I've got an example of that, and I can quickly show you, which is quite interesting.
Oh, cool.
From something we do each year it's called the Textile Tracker, and so we look at behaviours towards clothing. And if I just scroll up here, there's one which talks about environmental factors, so environmental and ethical factors. So we ask people about how important is this for them. So this is where you kind of people give you the answer possibly that they expect they should be giving. So is clothing that is made to last important to you? And 76% of people say yes, clothing which is made to last is very important. But then we also ask them a second time, well, do you look for that when you buy it? And then you see the drop. So less people are actually looking for it. So that's where you start to see the discrepancy between behaviour and actual perceived behaviour and actual behaviour.
Interesting. Could you ever do research where you watch someone buy clothes, so you found out what they said and then you could follow them and see what their actual behaviours were? Have you ever tried something like that?
We haven't done, purely because that would be hugely expensive, Holly. It'd be massively expensive to follow people. But yeah,
it's maybe slightly unethical.
Well, it's one of the things we talk about a lot, because we talk about the durability of clothing as well. And there's lots of things that brands and retailers, when they're creating clothing, can do to enhance durability and make clothing last longer. But actually, that's only ever the potential to make clothing last longer. It's not the actual. Because you and me, Holly, we could buy the same jumper, and you could wear it for best on Sundays, and I could wear it to the allotment every day. So, whatever that brand or retailer engineered into that jumper makes no difference, because we are going to use it in completely different ways. So those kind of long studies, we've talked about doing them, but you're talking about following clothes for 5-10 years to find out how they're being used and how they're being washed, how they're being cared for. Massive studies.
Interesting.
Where did I get to, Holly? Remember?
So you were talking about, we just wrapped up on the different consumer groups.
Yes, so I got to 6. So actually, I won't share any more there. I'll come out of that.
I just have one more question on that.
Yeah.
I find it interesting how the people with the behaviour we want the most also have the lowest values or social values, and we ignore them. Like, I'm not sure, it's not really a question, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
So how do you mean there? Just give me a bit more.
So the people who are wearing the clothes the longest, the group that have the least values about it, they're the ones that care the least about the environment, about waste.
Yeah.
And we're discounting them, I guess, because they're already doing what we want.
That comes down to their impact. So how big is their impact? So one of the things we often look at is where are the hot spots? Where can we actually get the biggest bang for our buck? So for those people, they're not buying clothes. So actually talking to them about clothing makes very little impact to them. And actually, as I said earlier, WRAP also has the consumer brand Recycle Now. So they will be getting communications through that from their local authorities. And that's a good way of reaching them to talk about how you dispose of items in the right way, rather than actually trying to engage them on clothing when they don't want to be engaged on clothing. It's not part of who they are. They're not interested in it. It's a functional item for them.
I guess we can also learn from them as well, no? About that you don't always have to sell the values of caring about the environment to have a behaviour like wearing clothes the longest.
Exactly. But the thing is with clothing, it's it's a very emotional purchase. How many of us go shopping for clothing with a list or even an idea of what we want to buy? And it is part of our tracker. We do ask people to think about the last time they went shopping, and did they go with an item in mind? Did they get that item? And then how many other items did they buy while they were shopping? Because it's an emotional thing that makes us all feel better. It's very different from our food team when they're talking about love food, hate waste. If you buy an apple and you don't eat that apple, it's going to rot on the table in front of you, and you're going to see the wastefulness of that purchase. But that nice orange jumper that you once bought that not quite love as much as you used to, it can sit in the back of the wardrobe for a long time, quite happily. And those are the clothes we want to get back into active use. What I was going to say was that there's some videos that we have on each of the segments. So they're available on the Love Your Clothes YouTube channel, which anybody can have a look at. They're nice and short. So there's one which talked about why we did the segmentation and what it covered. And then there's one for each of the 6 segments, and they're only about 2 minutes long, but they give a nice introduction to each of the segments. And we produce those because we want to engage people with this research. We have this behavioural segmentation work. We also have the textile tracker work we've done. And one other thing that I wanted to quickly touch on was some work we're doing in Europe now. So as I mentioned, we run the Sustainable Clothing Action Plan. Well, we also, as part of that, developed a European Clothing Action Plan. And that's kind of very similar to SCAP in its model, but it has some key differences. And I've got a nice slide here, if I can just get to it, which just talks about ECAP. So obviously SCAP is great and it's having a massive impact, and we're already seeing we're 5 years in, and we're seeing 10% reduction in carbon and a 15% reduction in water use from the brands and retailers which are taking part. So we wanted to take that model and extend it into Europe. So here we're really looking about how we can extend the circular economy. So we're working with an organisation called the Danish Fashion Institute, and they're working with designers about how they can design for longevity. We've got a partner called Made By, who are working with brands and retailers about their fibre strategy, and then looking to work with their suppliers to see how we can be more resource efficient. Another partner from Holland called Rijkswaterstaat, who are looking at public procurement of clothing, but also looking quite interestingly about getting brands and retailers to specify recycled fibres. So recently, ASOS launched a jeans range, which included post-consumer recycled content, and that was an output from the ECAP project, which is really cool. But what we're doing here is we're trying to see how we can take our knowledge of behaviours around clothing and the Love Your Clothes brand, and how we can take that into Europe. So we did some work looking at consumer behaviours across Europe, and there's not a huge amount of differences. We looked in Germany, for instance, households do fewer washes per week than across other nations. In Italy, they do a lot of ironing going on in Italy, but they've also got high levels of passing clothing items to their friends and family. the Dutch, from the countries we surveyed, are the most likely to want to learn a sewing or repair skill. So with that information and the Love Your Clothes knowledge that we've developed in the UK, what we're now looking for is partners really to help us spread these messages further afield. And I think that's one of the key takeaways that I would like to get out today, is that we have a lot of knowledge, but we're willing to share it. So if organisations are interested in running campaigns around clothing and changing people's behaviours, then we've got a vast back catalogue of insight and materials which are ready to be used. I've got a few questions coming in here as well.
We do have lots of questions in. We've got quite a busy audience online, which is really nice to see. So a first question we have is from MW, who says, you hear a lot about the value actions gap. It would be very interesting to be able to look at actual consumer behaviour. Yes, it would. In the end, are you optimistic that we are able to change the behaviour of the bulk of the consumers and not just the ones that are already engaged?
Yeah, measuring behaviour change is one of the trickiest things we can do. So we can certainly measure the impact of our communications campaigns. We know who we're reaching, but without spending a long time surveying people, it's really difficult to actually know whether that message you gave them, which was timely and it reached them just at the right time, is going to have a real impact on their lives. So we have, again, it comes back to kind of reported behaviours, and we have to kind of look and see. One of the things that we do around certainly around wash behaviour is use things like the consumer trackers, where we're year on year asking the same questions, and hopefully over time we start to see a downward trend in things like wash temperatures, average wash temperatures, and we have seen that more and more people are moving to a 30-degree wash. Mm-hmm. We can't then say that's because of our activities, but we can measure that and we can see that the impact that's having.
I guess it's all these sort of big trends are very difficult to measure.
Very difficult to pin them down to your activity.
Mm-hmm. So we've spoken a bit about the consumer, and we've just got in a couple of questions about the role of business. So I'll get to those. So Sophie says, what has been the feedback from brands and businesses about this campaign of getting people to wear their clothes longer? Couldn't it just be argued that this is a reframing of buying less, which is detrimental to their business models?
Yes. So, the brands and retailers that are selling clothing are in the business of selling as much clothing as they possibly can. So we're engaging them on lots of different things. So one of the ways to engage them around these areas is about the durability. So actually, how can you position your clothes so that they last longer and you have a longer term relationship with that client? Now that's not going to be for every type of item that they're putting on, every category of item they're putting onto the market. So the faster fashion items, we'll actually talk to that brand and retailer about perhaps designing that so it is recyclable, and then talking around their core ranges, which are your suits, your trousers, the things that you're going to wear a lot of, actually making those last longer, because that's where you'll have a longer term relationship with that customer.
I guess I'd also like to point out here to all people at home, recycling, I know material recycling is something that's talked about a lot, but it's often, there's a lot more to it, or it's a lot more exciting than just turning, a t-shirt into a bit of insulation. There's actually a lot going on in that space, isn't there?
I mean, that's a really interesting area at the moment within the sort of reuse sector for textiles. There's a lot of projects which are just coming out of the back of universities and starting to become commercially viable, where we're going to take post-consumer clothing and turn it back into fibre and turn it back into fabric. It's really interesting stuff, and there's a lot of investment in there, and there's a lot of interest from the brands and retailers, because they want to look at different types of fibres. They want to be able to talk about the fact that they are choosing and using more sustainable fibres. Mm-hmm.
And so I guess different brands and businesses and retailers will appeal to these different segments or these 6 groups, and then through that they can decide what activities are most...
Exactly, and that's one of the things that we asked when we were doing the segmentation. So for each of those segments, we know where they're most likely to shop for clothing, we know where they're most likely to shop for their food. So it allows us to be a lot more targeted and have conversations with those organisations which we have good relationships with, and talk to them about how we can work together.
It's interesting. And I guess getting the individual to, do you ever see individuals shifting types, or do you think that they're quite set in their group?
I think the way we obviously present it as 6 groups, I think generally people will find themselves as a little bit of A and possibly a little bit of a couple of segments. I think to say you're definitely set in that one segment and that's the way you're always going to be, I think would be a bit hard to say, but I kind of see myself in two of those segments at least.
Interesting. And so we have another question from Hal, and he says, what can brands and retailers do to help push some of these segments into more environmentally friendly behaviours? And so I know we touched on it depends on the brand and the consumer, but what are the sort of main, are there any things that all areas can do, all brands can do?
Well, there's a couple of things really. So first thing is they can have a conversation with their customer about the wider impact of clothing, and they're starting to do that around social. So there's been lots of movement in the clothing sector about thinking about where clothes are made and having transparency within their supply chain. So what we're looking to do is then have including within that conversation some of the environmental impacts. So start to have a conversation about, well, actually we are sourcing 60% more sustainable forms of cotton, and that is reducing our impact. And that a lot of that information is available if you want to go and find it, but it's usually within the their CSR reports. So actually, it's kind of for us having to ask at the moment to get it. But what we're trying to do is encourage people to open up that conversation. I think the 2 main things we want brands and retailers to talk about, and where we're currently talking about, is one is about not putting clothes in the bin. So that brand and retailer has put a lot of effort into creating that lovely garment of clothing you're now wearing. So it's in their interest to say, actually, dispose of this in the right way when you no longer like it. And you're starting to see more and more brands and retailers are looking at take-back schemes. So M&S were one of the first in the UK where they launched swapping. But now you're seeing H&M doing it as well, and other brands are now looking at whether they should be taking back clothing and bringing it back into their supply chain. And the last one, which we're really interested in, is that move towards 30-degree washes. So
and why is that? Why is the 30-degree wash so important?
So if you remember my graph earlier, laundry behaviour is all about the carbon impact. So simply by dialing down, using a lower temperature wash, you're using less carbon. So about a third of the carbon impact of clothing is in the in-use phase. It's me and you and our behaviours towards it. So don't put it in the tumble dryer. Think about lower temperature washes.
And freeze your jeans. That's one I've heard.
Well, yeah. I mean, the question is, do you need to wash your jeans at all? Jeans are designed not to be washed, really.
So we have another question in from Graham. They're streaming in. So everyone at home, remember, still time to ask your questions. Get them in. Graham says, when you talk to and about consumers, is there any concern/awareness that bigger impacts could be further up the chain?
Bigger impacts further up the chain. So no is the answer there. So when back in 2012, when we first started looking at clothing, we did a piece of work called Valuing Our Clothes, which is available on the WRAP website, and it's a good read. It's quite a short summary. Usually our documents are 100+ pages. This one isn't. And it was updated recently as well in 2016. So we looked at the entire life cycle of clothing from cultivation to end of life. And that's how we managed to map where all the hotspots were. So as going back to one of the first slides I showed, that the main opportunities for reducing the environmental impact of clothing is the single biggest one is extending life of clothing, which is why we're talking to consumers. The next one is the fibre impact, which is why we're talking to brands and retailers and working with them to get them to switch. So no, there aren't upstream or downstream. We've done that work. We know where the hotspots are, and that's where we're engaged.
And that is a person's behaviour, which makes sense, I guess. If you're going to wear your clothes longer, you aren't going to need any more of them than you have. What do you think about the second-hand clothing market? Do you think that kind of sits outside this conversation? That
no, not at all.
Can swap in and out?
No, reuse is definitely part of the conversation. Obviously, reuse is better than recycling from an environmental point of view. So we encourage reuse. It's interesting, isn't it? You know, you look at children's clothing. It's socially acceptable to go to a friend's house who has children and give them a bag of children's clothes. But if you walk through the door and offered them a bag of your clothes, would that be quite as acceptable? Why is that weird and different? So reuse, yep. So reuse with charities is great. So charities make a lot of money, and it supports their work. And then there's lots of commercial recyclers also, you know, keeping the economy afloat through their businesses through recycling and reuse as well. And that kind of point of reuse is where we also then start to see how you can segregate between reuse and recycling clothing. So, you know, the point of it, this garment is still reusable and can be used, or actually no, it now needs to be go to a different solution.
Cool. And just having a look at the questions, we have, oh no, sorry, we've already done that question. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. I guess another point I'd find very interesting to touch on quickly is, do you think that the big business and retailers can help in their messaging, in their marketing to consumers? What would you like to see in the future, if you could imagine that?
So, you know, we're not particularly interested in, or we are interested. We don't mind whether they brands and retailers and big businesses want to use our brands. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that message gets taken forward. So you see that with Recycle Now, and you've seen that with our Love Food, Hate Waste campaign. So what we want to do is find the right partner to help us deliver the right message. So if that is a message around wash at 30 degrees, that's fine. That works for them. If they want to talk about just around not putting clothing in the bin, that's fine. If they want to take part in the Love Your Clothes campaign, that's brilliant for us, because it means our brand's getting out there. But it's more important is the message, and having lots of people saying the same messages, so it starts to become part of what we do and what we know.
I think that's almost a very lovely point in itself, isn't it? That messaging is the key part of changing behaviour. I guess, did you look into a lot of psychology of how to change people's behaviours when doing this research?
Yeah, so there's lots of different models around how behaviour change and the best way to do it. I think possibly there's so many different ways you can go around this. One of my favourites is where you look at opportunity versus motivation, and you know, it's quite a, if you give somebody the opportunity to do the right thing and they're motivated at the same time, then it will happen. But finding that sweet spot when they are motivated and they have the opportunity is the key. So we often talk about moments of change. That's quite a key one for us. So, you know, perhaps if you're going to university for the first time, so you're therefore looking at your clothes in a different way about what you want to take. Or if you're leaving university, you know, we do quite a lot of work there. So or moving house, you know. So there's lots of different points where we can try and capture people, but actually we want to engage them in that conversation all the time, really.
And can social media play a big part in those moments? I guess you can see
massively. So Love Your Clothes is almost entirely driven by social media at the moment. So we have a strong Twitter and Facebook following, producing lots of materials which are social first. You know, that's kind of the way that the campaign goes now.
And a last question come in from Sam, which I think is a really lovely point to end this on. What is next for this campaign? What lies in store in the future? So
we're going to continue on in the UK. So the next thing that the Love Your Clothes team in the UK are going to be doing is they're going to be doing some work with Oxfam in the new year. We're going to be in Oxfam stores around the country, selected stores over a week, encouraging people to buy second-hand, but then also maybe to have a play with that garment. So maybe it's a bit too long, or maybe it doesn't quite fit properly. Well, we're going to put a seamstress in that Oxfam store so we can change it there and then for you, and really encourage people to buy second-hand. And then the other big thing, what next, is taking Love Your Clothes into Europe if we can, and finding partners who are interested in the message and perhaps want to make it work for them in whatever way we can. So we can share our research and share our findings and hopefully engage a wider audience in this conversation.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming and talking to us today and our lovely audience at home. And I guess the main takeaway for all of us is wear your clothes that little bit longer.
And don't put it in the bin.
And don't put it in the bin. Don't put it in the bin. Wear it longer. I think 2 easy, possibly takeaways for all of us to remember. Thank you very much for coming in. Is it right that we can get this report online if we'd like to do some more reading?
So you can go to wrap/sustainable clothing, and if you go to the Wrap website, it's all there. And then the Love Your Clothes website, I encourage everybody to go to Love Your Clothes and like us and share us and get involved.
And check out the videos on your YouTube, is that right? The little 2-minute videos, which I'm going to be heading over to after this. So everyone at home, just to let you know, Wrap will be joining us again for another session this Thursday at 2 p.m. Staying within the fashion area, they'll be exploring how designers can transform the fashion industry. So I'll be looking at it from a different angle. And another session I'd like to point out is Lewis Dartnell's A Short History of Technology. And that is on very shortly, I believe, in about half an hour. And this is a fantastic session to check out. It's about an engrossing book he wrote called The Knowledge, which starts from the hypothetical scenario that the world, as we know, has ended. Doesn't really matter whether it's a virus or an asteroid. The real question is, how do we rebuild what we had? What do we need to know? What do we need to do to be able to do that? And it sort of peers into the layers of modern technology. And if you're a maker, a tinkerer, or just curious about how the world and how the stuff in it is put together, it's definitely a session for you. And you can ask all your questions during that. So thank you to everyone at home for joining. Thank you for our wonderful speaker for joining. And see you next time.